Hello and welcome back. Today we are continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and we are going to be talking about resources and their PMs as it relates to kind of what your strategy should be in regards to these resources, as well as how you should be trading them, these sorts of things. This video is going to be deeply informed by, a lot of spreadsheet math, and so this is going to be the kind of thing. But before we get into the spreadsheet math, I'm just going to break down what we're going to talk about. Okay, so first of all, we're going to talk about some simple rules, just the very simple bare basics. If you just want the strategy and none of the explanation, just stay tuned for the beginning or come back for the summary where we're going to be touching on it again. Next, we're going to talk about common misconception, I think, when it comes to the resource industries, a misconception I had for quite some time. Then we will be talking about throughput, which is essential for understanding why the resource industries can look extremely good on paper, and by on paper, I mean in a spreadsheet, why they can look extremely good on paper, but not necessarily be as good as they look. Then we will be kind of jumping back into the spreadsheet and focusing more on the spreadsheet as we kind of jump into a deeper discussion, an extended discussion regarding several of the different industries, as well as some nuances or some interesting things that we can see out of the spreadsheet PMs. You'll see that have every PM in there. There's going to be different inflection points at various points of the game, but let's jump into our quick explanation of stuff inside of Victoria 3. So first of all, the most important thing to emphasize, everything is really about just increasing the investment pool transfer as much as possible, which is going to be based on the weekly balance and who owns the buildings. So for the most part, the most important thing is getting onto PMs as quickly as possible that are going to be capitalist owned, because they contribute 20% of their dividends to the investment pool. So 20% of this balance is going to the investment pool. Now, if we are on, PMs of picks and shovels, they will be shopkeeper owned, which only contribute 5% to the investment pool. This is the most important and essential thing. And if we were to jump back into the spreadsheet, you will see the numbers that are highlighted in yellow. This is how much investment pool we are getting per construction, which is kind of our most important metric. Okay, jumping back into here, we're going to talk about each industry here, and then we will talk about other stuff. So first of all, let's talk about logging camps. Logging camps are extremely good in the early game, the super early game. They're efficient, they're extremely efficient, and they're extremely efficient with sawmills, and they should be the thing you build absolute first. They are going to give you the most in terms of the investment pool. However, logging camps fall off. They suffer just like rubber and fishing wharves and whaling stations, all from the same thing, which is that they have a ceiling for the amount of throughput they can get, and so this means that they are going to become kind of middling as the game goes on. Rubber is just kind of generally, you can think of it as a convenience industry where you don't really necessarily want to push it. The main reason you don't want to push rubber isn't due to it being inefficient, but it is going to be owned by the landowners. If we find some rubber here, and by here I mean there, if we find some rubber, we will see that they are going to be owned by aristocrats. And so this aristocratic ownership means they will be contributing 10% to the investment pool. So even if they have an efficient PM, they are still not going to give as much to the investment pool as we would like. But still, we build them largely because we unlock a PM and suddenly we need an enormous amount of rubber. And so we'll build it ourselves just to be able to make use of like the PMs like elastics when we research vulcanization. Okay, jumping back in. Fishing wharves and whaling stations are both very interesting because, fishing wharves, first off, they give fish, which is a basic food need, which can actually decrease your need for grain. And fishing wharves are also very efficient, but the problem is you can't get a lot of throughput on them, and so they're kind of a medium thing to build. In particular, when you unlock gantry cranes and steamships, they will be extremely useful to get. We could just take a quick look at those techs. So when you unlock these two techs here, you will generally want to kind of finish expanding out all of your fishing and all of your whaling. Whaling is a bit interesting. It is going to be good. It gives a little bit of oil and a little bit of meat, and meat is a part basic, part luxury, and so this is going to be good for discouraging your queue from building meat. In the same way, fishing wharves are good for discouraging your auto queue from building grain, because these are substitute goods for each other for a lot of the things. And so this discourages livestock farms, so it's useful in that way because livestock is aristocratic owned and it's relatively efficient, but you're generally going to want to build out your whaling stations, in particular when you get a certain tech, and that tech is vacuum canning, because this will allow you to make use of oil. It's generally the first oil usage tech you get, and then the whaling stations will be extremely extremely efficient, and they will provide generally enough oil for you to start using that PM. Okay, jumping in. Iron is a standout sort of resource, and the reason why is that their demand in the early game is extremely high, which means you can build it tall in the early game, which means you can get a lot of the throughput bonus, and so this is important. And so iron mine is one of the few resources you actually might even want to export in the early game to increase demand for it, to allow you to build it taller. We'll come back to why that's so important in a second, but you will probably want to export iron super early and then swap to importing it as the game goes on. Now, for just kind of a brief heuristic in terms of why we talk about importing and exporting here. When we import a good from another country's market, we increase the price in that market, which makes it more profitable for their auto queue to build. And so by importing these resources, which eventually you will run out of, which is our case here in Italy, by encouraging the other countries to build them, you are going to overall smooth out the price of the resources over the course of the game, and so importing them is generally good. There's a couple exceptions, and that's iron and sulfur. Iron in the early game, you want to try and push the economies of scale, and so you want to export it early and then swap to importing once that becomes not as much of a concern. Okay, because you want to get other countries to build it, generally speaking, importing coal and lead will be efficient throughout the game, and so this is our general strategy for these. For sulfur, sulfur has the most efficient PM in the game in regards to contributing to the investment pool per construction. The problem with sulfur is often the price of sulfur will get very depressed or low, and so it won't be efficient because the price is cheap. And so what you want to do in general is, as long as sulfur is not really expensive, you actually want to be exporting sulfur. That way you can have a higher proportion of your businesses to be contributing more to the investment pool per construction. Allow me to repeat that because I think it's worth repeating. The reason that you kind of want to, the way you are massaging your economy with trade imports and exports is such that you are trying to have the highest percentage of your buildings contributing as much as possible to the investment pool per construction it takes to build them. And because sulfur is the most efficient out of any PM ever, exporting sulfur will be good. Pretty much until like you start running a shortage. You never want to run a shortage of goods, so you don't want to export it. Okay, and then finally we have oil. Now oil is extremely efficient, and it also gives you extremely efficient PMs, but it's not very abundant. And so generally what you're going to want to do with oil is you are going to want to create demand for oil because it's efficient and produce as much oil as possible as quickly as possible. We're not doing a very good job of that here in Italy right now because our price of oil is extremely low. We don't really have any PMs for it, and so we have a hard time creating demand, but it will be very efficient if you can get the demand up early, and then late game you actually want to try and decrease your oil usage because there will generally be shortages. But just know that, you know, kind of expanding it as quickly as possible and expanding the demand is going to be a good thing because the PM is extremely efficient. Okay. So the common misconception, I think, is regards to how we generally want our prices of our goods to look. And I think that, and I was someone who was like this in the early game. I was like, look, I want all my industries to be super profitable, so I want to get, you know, iron as cheap as possible, coal as cheap as possible, etc. So these buildings could be super profitable. They contribute more to the investment pool. Big ups. I'm super happy. The problem with this is it really doesn't matter whether something is a manufacturing or it's a resource industry, right? What we care about is the weekly balance in the ownership. The resource industries, with the exception of rubber, are all owned by capitalists who contribute as much to the investment pool as possible. So it really doesn't matter if our logging camps are extremely profitable or if our furniture manufacturers are extremely profitable. The extent to which it makes a difference is making construction goods cheap. Okay? That way we can kind of sort of ramp out construction, but to a large extent, this is only super important in the early game when we are experiencing huge spikes of stuff. In the early game, you might want to try and depress construction good prices, but in the later game, it's more just about the spikes and smoothing out the construction cost than necessarily depressing it. Because if you have an enormous amount of, let's say, iron mines, if what you have the most of is an iron mine, and you make the price of iron extremely cheap, or let's talk about sulfur mines perhaps, because I know where we can find some sulfur here. If all you have is sulfur mines, you really don't want the price of sulfur to be low, because all of your balance is coming from the fact that sulfur is expensive, and so this is making the building profitable. And so the common misconception is that we really care about the profitability of the manufacturers, and we don't care about the profitability of the resource industries that contribute into them. These resource industries, we care about if they are capitalist owned. We notably swapped that one off. We care about them if they're capitalist owned, and we don't care about them if they're not capitalist owned. So for example, we don't care so much about the profitability of the silk plantation because it's going to be owned by aristocrats, but as far as making the manufacturing like more profitable at the expense of making, you know, the iron less profitable, it's a wash. It doesn't really matter one way or the other, and so you don't necessarily want to chase low prices of resources, especially if a larger percentage of your market is invested in those resources, or a larger percentage of your buildings are in those resources. You actually just want the prices to be high. So early game, when you focus on building a ton of iron mines, you actually don't really want the price to be extremely low. The low price will give you cheaper construction, yes, but it will also decrease your investment pool by just nuking the industry. And instead, when you focus on iron in the early game, you'll just have a smoother construction price overall, because you have a ton of iron, and this amount of iron is increasing your investment pool when it's high, and then when it's low, your construction cost is decreased. And so it's not simply the case that you want to get all of these resources as cheap as possible. You should be more net neutral in terms of your attitude, and you're just trying to make your buildings in general as profitable as possible. Okay, so that's the common misconception. Now we need to talk about throughput. And so throughput is an interesting thing, and your auto queue doesn't really have a consideration for throughput. And as a human player, you should have a consideration for throughput, because throughput has what's called increasing marginal returns. And what that means is the higher your throughput goes, the more valuable it is. You will see here, we have a throughput of 7% from economies of scale and 10% from honest work on the rural folk. Let's just pretend this 10% from the rural folk does not exist. In fact, we could probably select an industry where it doesn't exist. Let's do that instead. So the fishing wharves, we just have 11% throughput from economies of scale. Whenever you build an additional building, you increase your throughput bonus up to a cap. The cap is 20 at the start of the game. It increases by plus 10 with mechanized workshop and plus 20 with shift work for a total of plus 50. Now coming back here, the way it works is when you build the second building, you build the first building. That first building is worth 100% of the building. There's no throughput bonus. Fairly simple, right? When you build the second building, that building's not worth 100% of the building. You will now have a throughput bonus of 1%. So that building itself that you built will be worth 101% of the building, but it also increases the previous building to 101% of a building. So that building is effectively worth 102% of a building. You can see where this is going, where the third, the fourth, and the fifth building will be worth more and more and more and more. As we build, for example, the fifth building, or the sixth building rather, we will have a throughput bonus of 105%, right? This will be, the building itself will be 105% because the new throughput bonus is 105%, but it will also give an additional 1% to the previous 5 buildings built because it's the sixth building. So it will actually be worth 110% of a building. This starts making a big difference as you start to get larger and larger and larger, and the 51st building that you build is going to move the economies of scale bonus from 49% to 50% on 50 buildings that you built previously, and it's also going to give you a 50% bonus on the 51st building itself, and so the 51st building is worth 200% of a building before you include other types of bonuses and such to throughput, which there are in the game. But this is going to mean that it has increasing marginal returns, right? The second building is worth, 102%. The 9th building is worth 116%. The 51st building is worth 200%, right? In terms of its efficiency through construction. And so why is this important? Well, the resource industries on a lot of resources, these can't be built up to level 51. So we cannot acquire the maximum throughput bonus, right, on a lot of the resource industries. And so what this means is that for the most part, these are going to be less efficient in terms of construction than manufactories, or they are going to be less efficient than they look in the spreadsheet as we look later. So for example, just quickly like cruising through and looking at the spreadsheet, we will see that wood, aka the chops, they have an efficiency score here of 52 when we're on electric sawmills, and this looks absolutely insane when you are comparing it to, for example, one of the most efficient in elastics in the textile mills. But you have to keep in mind that we can build any textile mill to 51, and we can get the bonus there. There's no level 51 that you can ever build on a chop, right? And so we have to take this into consideration. But what this means is that resource industries in general are contributing more to the investment pool, but in general, you can't build them as high in regards to throughput, and you can't acquire some late game throughput bonuses. And so what this means for you as the player is that these are going to be extremely good early on, and then they're going to fall off a little bit, but still be relatively strong, especially because generally all the resources become expensive late game. That's kind of another thing. If your outputs, if we have, plus 50% price on wood, then this output is not worth 2,000, right? It's worth 3,000. And if we change the output to 3,000, suddenly we dramatically positively affect, the construction efficiency. And so this is important to keep in mind on throughput. And there's one little sort of like asterisk to this sort of thing, which is that in some places you can get 51 throughput, and not only can you get 51 throughput, let's find perm, you will get even more than that. So if we take a look at perm, we are getting a 20% iron mines building throughput. Generally speaking, for manufactories, you can't get throughput bonuses anywhere with the exception of shipyards and electricity. And so what this means, or actually electricity is technically not throughput, but what this means is that we can get enormous throughput, for example, on these iron mines. They don't even have shift work yet. Poor guys. But these iron mines can get enormous throughput because they get Ural mountain range and also economies of scale. And so resources that particularly go over 51 are going to be worth really looking to push hard at any point in the game, because they are going to be extraordinarily efficient, because the disadvantage of resources relative to manufacturing is usually you can't build them up to 51. When you can build them up to 51, you want to do this. And this is another thing to kind of keep in mind with the AI. The AI, when it is choosing what it wants for private construction, what it's going to do is it's going to just build the most profitable buildings possible. And it is looking at the marginal building. It is not looking at what it is doing to the profitability of all the previous buildings. This is my understanding of the AI. And so when it builds the 51st building, it only views it as 150% of the building. But you as the player know that the 51st building is giving the 1% economies of scale bonus to all the previous 50 buildings, and so it's really worth 200%. And this is important to emphasize, just in a general sense, is the AI auto build will underappreciate the value of economies of scale, and so you as a player want to try and push economies of scale as much as you can, and it's difficult to push in the resource industry. Okay, so that's throughput. So let's look at the spreadsheet, and here's where things get sweaty. So, if you want to click away, if you're under the age of 12, you need to consult a parent before looking at this. Okay, so here we have, just very, very simply, the net is the value of the resources, the input required, minus the value of the output, the outputs minus the value of the inputs is the net. And this is based on base prices, not actual prices. And so, for example, if electricity is really expensive, let's say our input is, more expensive, it's going to make this number less efficient. What this number is the net efficiency per construction multiplied by ownership, or how much the ownership will contribute to the investment pool. Okay, so the construction of wood, it's 8 weeks on normal, or sorry, not on normal. It's 8 weeks base before any modifiers, and so we are getting our net divided by our construction is 181, and this multiplied by 0.29, which is what you get with happy industrialists, and on laissez-faire is going to be 52, and that's how we get this number. This is the number we really care about. This is the number we're going to talk about, okay? And so this is kind of just for understanding the spreadsheet, and let's get into the industries themselves, okay? So for the chops, you'll notice something. Sawmills is extremely early tech. and it's going to have a construction efficiency of 36. There is no other tech there's no other resource you can build extremely early in the game that it's going to have anywhere near this much. It's also important to note the difference between simple forestry and sawmills is absolutely enormous, because the simple forestry is shopkeeper owned, so it's only going to provide 5% to the investment pool, whereas this is capitalist owned, so it's going to provide 20% if you're on interventionalism. If you're on, by the way, traditionalism, it's actually only going to be 0.1% because it's got a huge negative modifier, which is going to negatively affect things. And so I think I just have this. Yeah, that's this over here. And so if you're on traditionalism, it's not going to be as pronounced. But it's still going to be a big difference between 3.8 and 12.5. This is why, in the extremely early game, you are going to want to build a bunch of wood. The problem you will run into as you build a bunch of wood, is that you are not going to benefit as much from throughput. Now, for example, the net, let's take a quick look at the way throughput works for just a moment here in the thing, because I think we did not talk about exactly how it works. We did not talk about exactly how, there we go, exactly how it works. The way throughput works is this percentage, it increases the amount of inputs and it increases the amount of outputs by that percentage. Very simple. It does not increase wages by that percentage. And so it will make each building worth more of a building, but not only that, it will also make the buildings more profitable because you are not proportionally increasing the wages by that amount as well. And so throughput is more valuable the higher percentage of the total cost of the building is, the total inputs is, the higher percent wages are, the more useful throughput will even be, even though it's already useful because it's creating more of a building. Okay, so back to the chops. Back to the future. The future is now, old man. The future is the spreadsheet. Okay, so talking about this, so sawmills is going to be extremely efficient. And then also, when we are looking at this, the problem with sawmills is often you're only going to get up to about, I don't know, let's say a throughput of 15 on the sawmill. So what will happen is if we just increase the net, because we're increasing the inputs and the outputs, if we increase the net by 15%, in this case it'll be 1150, we'll see that the construction efficiency goes up to 41, okay? Let's Control Z, or let's keep that. If we go to the diesel pump engine and we increase this, but instead we give it, 50% throughput bonus, and increase it to 3K, you'll see that even though normally it's not anywhere near as efficient as, the sawmills will be, when you apply when you apply the fact that this building can get a higher throughput, it will look a lot better. And you can never get an extremely high throughput on the chops. But in the very early game, it doesn't matter because you can't get a very high throughput because you haven't built all the buildings yet. And so that's why opening steps, you should really force the wood quite a lot. And then afterwards, you should not. Important thing to note about hardwood, this is the only net neutral PM, which I find interesting, but after you research mnemonic tools, which will give you 25% hardwood output, it becomes efficient. I just thought that was worth noting. So, iron mines and lead mines are both the same, which is why we kind of didn't do another section just for them. But what you're going to want to do in terms of the strategy is you can build up your iron mines to the cap of 20 very, very quickly. And so if we take a look at, sawmills, maybe we get up to 10 kind of in a couple places, and we're going to have like this efficiency of 39, right? If we look at condensing pump engine, which we can get in the early game, and we are looking to push kind of an early 20% throughput, I'm not sure what the math is on this exactly, but if we go this, we will have a respectable amount, and notably, we can keep increasing it. It has increasing marginal returns, and so when you export the iron, it allows you to build more iron, which allows you to specialize more, which allows you to push throughput, and throughput has increasing marginal returns, and so that's why I think you should export iron in a very narrow band of the early game before stopping exporting it and starting to import it, just until you can get the caps on economies of scale in the place where you're building the iron mines. And after this, it becomes less important as it decreases as a percentage of your overall industry. While most of your industry is still iron mines, you don't want to start importing because you don't want to depress the price of iron, because if iron's expensive, it makes all your industries more profitable. Okay. But here we go. So that's kind of the strategy with the iron mine. You'll notice a pretty big jump from here, from atmospheric engine pump to condensing engine pump, even though they're very close to each other in the tree. This is true for kind of all the industries, but let's jump back into, talking about this in terms of technology strategy. If we look at the production tech, right? Here's atmospheric engine pump. Here's water tube boiler. Atmospheric engine pump, condensing pump engine. You will often want to, if you are focusing on iron, you'll want to get water tube boiler really fast. And if you're focusing on tools, which is another opening strategy, it's less important to get water tube boiler so fast. But this is going to be this tech is extremely strong. It's very, condensed, in terms of, its relative distance from the previous tech. And so very often you are going to want to do this to facilitate an early game strategy of focusing on iron first. Okay, so that's iron. Sulfur, you'll note, this number is absolutely huge. It is the most efficient PM as a function of, the amount of investment pool you are getting per construction. But the problem with it is very often the price of it is depressed. And so you see here, this is the net. 800 goes in, 4K comes out. That's a net of 3,200. We're adding the dynamite on top of that for 3,700, which is where we get this. Now, for example, if it's depressed though, and let's say the value of the sulfur is only 2,000, you'll see it comes down a lot. And so, what this means for you as the player is you will want to export sulfur, because when you are encouraging more sulfur, when you export sulfur, you're encouraging more sulfur to be built. When you're building more sulfur, you are having more buildings that have an enormous net between their input and their output, the net per construction, which is going to lead to an increased construction or investment pool contribution per construction. And so when you export this, you're going to allow for more sulfur mines in your market, which is going to be just a better building in terms of how much it's contributing to the investment pool. The investment pool lets you build more. Bada bing, bada boom. This is why you want to export sulfur throughout the entire game. The only gold mines are tied, but gold mines are weird. This is just because the value of gold as a resource is 100, but that's not really the value. You should just always build gold mines. Gold mines are excellent. Okay, we take a look at coal mines. We'll notice they're not as efficient as lead mines. This makes it so, or lead and iron. This is a notable thing. You'll see 1624 versus 1421. If you were going to import one thing and build the other, you would prefer to import coal and build lead, iron and lead, although you will normally want to build both. That way you are not eating the price of someone else's tariff. And so you will generally want to build and import coal and lead and iron after the extremely early game. We take a look at oil rigs. We will see that it's 61. But this fails to capture that oil is it gives you extremely good PMs. So on top of it being extremely profitable, it's going to give you really good PMs. And so because of this, you really want to build a lot of oil. And if the oil price is low, you want to export it, right? Because it's the same idea as the sulfur, where you want to have a higher amount of these buildings that are extremely efficient in terms of, their inputs minus their their output minus their input. They're extremely efficient here, right? And so you just want to build them as much as possible. Okay, now why is this number? Oh, because it's plus the 500. So this is 3,700 and this is just 3,400. Okay, so this is kind of how you want to approach oil. Also, in the very late game, you want to kind of be strict with your oil usage in terms of what you're using it for, what PMs, but that's kind of a separate discussion to have more in your other industries. Now we have rubber plantation, and the number you want to look at is here, because this is when you are just on agrarian. You notice the numbers here are different for the rubber plantation. That's because these are landowner owned. And so, unfortunately, even though you have a really, really strong net output per construction, which is, the output minus the input divided by the construction. Even though you have a huge net, I believe it's the highest net in this entire section, the ownership of the building is such that it's not going to contribute as much to the investment pool. And so you don't really want to focus on rubber because you're either getting 10% or 16.3% repeating if you're on laissez-faire with happy capitalists, which 42 is decent. If you have happy capitalists and you're on, once you get onto, the publicly traded PM, then then this will become good and is something you can build, because you notice it will be giving you not as much as electric sawmills, but generally speaking, rubber can kind of build up a little bit taller than wood. Again, rubber also has the problem of you're not going to build it to 51, so this number, you should discount it on that basis. But it suffers from the fact that it is owned by aristocrats. You generally build the rubber just so you can use good PMs that you've unlocked, for the manufacturers. Like if we look in the consumers and exportables, we will see elastics. The jump from here to here is pretty big, right? From craftsman showing to elastics. And this is why you want to build rubber more so than its value as a resource by itself. Okay. Now, fishing wharves and whaling stations are a little bit weird. They notably are extremely efficient with steam trawlers or steamships. If you take a look, fishing trawlers, they're like pretty okay. Steamships, they're extremely good. And they will also have an effect in terms of your market, in terms of influencing your auto queue. If we look in agriculture and we look at like simple farming, fertilizers, all these are not that efficient before you have publicly traded. And what you can do whenever you build, either fishing wharves or whaling stations, you are discouraging your queue from building grain and from building livestock farms. And this discouragement has value that's difficult to evaluate. And these PMs are relatively good, but here's the problem. There's no level 51 fishing anywhere, and so they're going to suffer from that thing. Generally speaking, as far as strategy goes, I think what you do is as soon as you get on steam trawlers, you just max all these out, and until then, you maybe put them on auto, you can put them on auto expand, but you don't necessarily auto expand them yourselves. If you have one of these industries on auto expand, what will happen, let's jump back in here, is when the building becomes profitable, if we just let's say we're in here and this is not fully built out and we put it on auto expand, what will happen is as soon as it becomes profitable with a lot of cash reserves, it'll build another one. So usually that's in terms of once fish gets relatively expensive, fish is a substitute good for grain, but with a lower prioritization. And so because of this, you can kind of depress your auto queue's desire to build grain by putting fishing on auto expansion, and this will be good. It's specifically with the whales. Whales have an output of oil, and it's a small but modest output. If we take a look at the technology, we will see something that's kind of a little bit funny. So pump jacks is where you get oil. You will usually get vacuum canning through natural spread before you actively research pump jacks, which means you have a PM that uses oil, and it's actually a pretty good PM. And so if you unlock this PM and you don't have pump jacks, whales are super, super, super good just for giving you the ability to go onto this. Okay, and that's kind of the extended discussion there for all that. So just to kind of summarize and go through it really quick again, we will jump back in here and we'll talk about, for the Chop Chops, extremely good early game. You want to really push them. They suffer because they can't go really high on economies of scale, and so they will fall off. Notably, they are better than they look here because the hardwood production, this spreadsheet does not account for the fact that hardwood production will have mnemonic tools, so this is even better because that will give 25% throughput specifically on the hardwood. Okay, so good early, and then medium to still solid late game. Building wood will basically never be bad. For iron mines, you want to kind of specialize in this early and export in order to drive demand for it, but kind of once you are exiting the early game, you'll want to switch to importing iron. For lead, you just generally want to import it. When you're importing these goods from other markets, you will encourage their queues to build them, which will overall smooth out the resources as the game goes on. Resources, notably, you can't just build up forever. You are gated by the amount, which is unlike manufacturers. So as far as what other people are building, you would actually prefer they build these resources. Also, another reason why you focus on iron early is it doesn't have anything inherently to do with the PM. It's because there's enormous demand for iron early. And so you can push the high throughput from economies of scale. And as we saw, throughput is really good for just kind of evaluating anything. And so the combination of high throughput and high demand is going to make these buildings insanely efficient. Because, for example, if we have a throughput bonus of 50% and we go 1350 here, it's already as efficient as the next one. But then if we increase the price of the output, as well on top of that, and let's say it's 2K, because the good is extremely expensive, you know, it's still a pretty big pop-up. And so this is why you kind of want to push the iron. Something important to note, I guess, about throughput, just really quick touching on it, is you can create 20% throughput on the resource industries with encouraged resource industry. And you can create 20% throughput on encouraged manufacturing. Generally, this one will be best in the early game because resources are the best in the early game. And as the game goes on, encouraged manufacturing will be better because it will apply to more buildings, just for adding some extra throughput. So back into the browser and back into the summary. Okay. So sulfur mines, generally you just want to export them as much as you can until you are running a shortage, because this PM is just the most efficient PM in the game. The name of the game is increasing the proportion of your buildings that are contributing a lot to the investment pool per construction, and this is the most efficient one you can have. And so even though this is a resource and you do want kind of the other players building resources or the computer AI, because this one's so efficient, you build it yourself. Coal mines, you generally want to import coal and you want to build these yourself. They're quite efficient, but also important to note for all of these, dynamite and nitroglycerin don't add an enormous amount, and so don't necessarily prioritize this to make these buildings more efficient. A good reason to prioritize these is the discovery of gold. Oil is extremely efficient. Often the price will be depressed and you will want to export it initially, and then the price will become insanely high because there's shortages, and then you will want to import it. Rubber plantations are unfortunately owned by landowners, and so this will make them kind of less of a good shout, but once you get on automatic irrigation and publicly traded, they are decent. And you wouldn't want to export rubber, but you would want to build it yourself. Fishing wharves and whaling stations both encourage you to kind of move away from agrarian stuff in terms of their outputs, and so they're good in that sense. Very often you kind of want to have them on auto expand, not really focus on them, except for whaling. When you get vacuum canning, becomes extremely good, and both of these become extremely good when you get stream trawlers, and I think that's a fairly good summary. So feel free to like, comment, subscribe, you know, do the YouTube algorithm, and have a good day.